I'm Paula McClean and I'm a lecturer at the Northern Ireland Centre for Stratified Medicine that's based at CTRIC on the Altnagalvin site. I'm an active researcher in dementia from a basic science and drug discovery perspective, but I'm really driven by something more important than academic curiosity, and that is lived experience. So from a young age, I have been exposed to the personal impacts of dementia. In childhood, I accompanied my grandmother to her regular visits to her sister who developed early onset Alzheimer's disease. And then cruelly later, my grandmother herself succumbed to the condition. And as a family, we really moved through the various challenges of living with dementia. And this really crystallized my aspiration to develop my career in this research area. So today we're going to cover some information with respect to what dementia is, how prevalent it is, to try to challenge some of the common misconceptions about dementia and consider why people delay seeking a diagnosis of dementia. We're also going to think about how we can reduce our personal risk of dementia and then reflect on the importance of research to advance our understanding of and hopefully eventually defeat dementia. So first off, what is dementia? So dementia is an umbrella term that's used to describe a group of symptoms, including memory loss, confusion, mood changes, and difficulty with day-to-day tasks. And Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, and it's associated with the buildup of proteins in the brain that are composed of beta amyloid protein and tau protein. But there are many other forms of dementia, including vascular dementia that's associated with damage to the blood vessels in the brain, dementia with Lewy bodies that's associated with the aggregation of a protein called synuclein, frontotemporal dementia, which is caused by damage to the cells in the frontal and temporal lobes in the brain. We also have posterior cortical atrophy, which is caused by damage to brain cells at the back of the brain that makes sense of what our eyes are seeing. And we have primary progressive aphasia, and this is associated with the damage that's caused by frontotemporal dementia. And in this type of dementia, speech and language are usually affected first. There are also innumerate rarer forms of dementia, and these affect less than 10 per 10,000 people. And this includes things like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and that's a brain condition that's associated with repeated head injury. So in terms of symptoms, dementia is associated with disruptions in language, memory, attention, recognition, problem solving and decision making, and symptoms slowly get worse until they get in the way of daily life. So the most common symptoms that we could all think of includes things like forgetting recent events, names and faces, putting things in the wrong place, not being sure of the date or time of day, finding it hard to use the right words or understand other people's words, asking the same questions, often in a short space of time, finding it hard to pay attention or make simple decisions, getting lost, mostly in places that are new. And then we have things like changes in behaviour, so becoming sad or easily upset or losing interest in things. So in terms of prevalence, there are about 850,000 people estimated to be living with dementia in the UK, and there's about 15,000 individuals in Northern Ireland who have a dementia diagnosis. And the scale of this problem is growing. A dementia attitudes monitor was commissioned by Alzheimer's Research UK, and this aimed to get an overview of the UK's understanding of and also their perceptions towards dementia. And the initial survey was carried out in 2018, and it was based on the responses of about 2,400 adults. And this monitor revealed that more than half of the UK public know someone who's been diagnosed with a form of dementia, and that's typically a family member such as a grandparent or a parent. What this dementia attitudes monitor also revealed was that awareness of dementia is increasing, but the understanding of the diseases that cause it remains low. So to that end, it's time to address some of the misconceptions from what we've considered so far. So misconception number one is that Alzheimer's disease is dementia. And one of the most common questions I am asked is, what is the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And many people think that every kind of memory loss is due to Alzheimer's disease. But this is not the case. So while Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, there are many other causes, and I introduced some of those earlier. So vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies or frontotemporal dementia. But there are some causes of memory loss that are reversible, such as those associated with hypothyroidism or infections or vitamin B12 deficiency. And these things are checked when someone presents to their GP with a memory complaint. Misconception number 2 is that dementia is an inevitable part of aging. So 1 in 5 UK adults, or 22% in that Dementia Attitudes Monitor, incorrectly agreed with the statement that dementia is an inevitable part of getting older, and a further 17% weren't sure. Personally, I think this may even be an underrepresentation of how many people feel this way, as the sample size within the monitor is relatively small. So this is not the case. Dementia is caused by physical disease processes. So our bodies, as we know, undergo many changes with aging. And as we age, some people may experience normal age-related changes in memory and thinking. But dementia or severe memory loss that interferes with daily life is not a part of the normal aging process. So in normal aging, it may mean that we have slower processing speeds or more difficulty with multitasking. But things like routine memory, skills, and knowledge are stable, and these may even improve with age. So it's completely normal to occasionally forget recent events, such as where you left your keys or the name of the person you just met. But in dementia, these symptoms progress to a level where they interfere with activities of daily living. And that is not a normal aging process. The Share the Orange campaign, led by, again, Alzheimer's Research UK, aimed to change the conversation about dementia not being a normal and inevitable part of aging. And many famous people, including Samuel L. Jackson, who has a strong family history of the condition, really put their weight behind this campaign. And the orange is of relevance because the Alzheimer's disease brain weighs about 140 grams less than that of a healthy brain. And that represents the weight of an orange and really illustrates that physical disease processes are responsible for the symptoms of the condition that we see. So again, if we can maybe illustrate the physical processes that are at play, I'll just use Alzheimer's disease as an example. So Alzheimer's disease is a pathophysiological process, not merely a condition ending in dementia. And what this means is that there's a really long time before any measurable effects on memory or daily living can be observed, but that there are changes occurring within the brain long before any symptoms manifest or can be measured. And this means that we have a really, really long preclinical period. Once cognition starts to drop off, we have this prodrome known as mild cognitive impairment. And this represents the point at which cognitive or memory deficits can be observed in these neuropsychological or memory assessments. But the difference between Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment is that Alzheimer's disease significantly interferes with activities of daily living. So, managing your finances and being able to contribute meaningfully to your day-to-day tasks in life. So this isn't a normal part of aging, and these changes in our brain occur years and years and years before a diagnosis is made. So we know from research that in Alzheimer's disease, these plaques develop in the hippocampus, and this is a structure deep in the brain that helps to encode memories. And they also aggregate in other areas of the cortex in the brain that are involved in thinking and making decisions. So there's been extensive research into the underlying disease processes, and this has identified these really common brain changes. And the leading hypothesis centers on the protein deposits in the brain, and that is that those amyloid plaques composed of beta amyloid protein and neurofibrillary tangles, which are composed of a protein called tau. And when these aggregate, it's accompanied by disruptions in neurotransmitter levels, lead to neuronal cell death, and also then eventually leads to brain atrophy or loss of brain cells and cell death. So to illustrate this more visually, on the slide here, we've got two brains. So the brain on the left is a normal brain, and the brain on the right is someone who's had Alzheimer's disease. Microscopic changes or large changes can be identified at the level of the whole brain. And you can see these with the naked eye, as we can see here. And this only happens at advanced stages. So in these postmortem brains that I have on the slide here, you can see that the brain on the right that's associated with Alzheimer's disease is smaller and has widened sulci or grooves. So there's clear cell loss that has caused these changes to the brain structure. Microscopic changes then are illustrated down below, where we see these brown dots in circles of amyloid protein and these black aggregations of tau protein inside the neurons. So these microscopic changes we can only see under a microscope, and we use stains for the proteins that are associated with these plaques and tangles. And these structures then interfere with cell-to-cell communication, so how our brain cells normally communicate with each other. They cause inflammation in the brain, and they ultimately lead to cell death. And that then feeds into those microscopic or large changes that we see at the level of the whole brain in reducing brain weight. So age is the biggest risk factor for dementia, and dementia is increasing in line with our aging population. So the number of people with dementia in the UK is expected to grow rapidly over the next several decades. And because obviously then age is the biggest risk factor, this increasing life expectancy is known to be the driving force behind this projected rise. And this reflects the advances in medicine that we've seen, whereby many conditions that had previously been associated with mortality, people now survive with a long time with many chronic conditions, and that's because of advances in medicine. So because we know age is the biggest risk factor for dementia, the older you are, the more likely that you are to develop dementia. But it's not inevitable. It's absolutely not inevitable. So our risk of dementia rises from about 1 in 14 over the age of 65 to 1 in 6 over the age of 80. And the purple graph at the bottom of this slide really illustrates that in both men and women, the estimated percentage of people living with dementia increases with age. So you can see the graph increasing as each bar goes across there. But what this also shows is that there's more women living with dementia at older ages. And this really is in agreement with the fact that women have a greater life expectancy than men. And that just illustrates that increased life expectancy and surviving to an older age will obviously increase one's risk. Misconception number 3 is that only elderly people can get dementia. And it's a really common misconception that dementia is a condition of older age. And sadly, this is not true. There are over 42,000 people in the UK under the age of 65 that have dementia. And in general, the earlier a person develops Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, the greater the chance that it is due to a faulty inherited gene. So this leads me into misconception number 4, and that is that dementia is a genetically inherited condition. So again, here I'm using Alzheimer's disease, the most common form, as an example. So familial Alzheimer's disease is a very rare form of Alzheimer's disease, and it's caused by genetic mutations that run in families. So there are 3 genes that are known to have these rare mutations. They're called presenilin-1, presenilin-2, and amyloid precursor protein. But what all of these mutations do is that they increase the production and accumulation of beta amyloid proteins. So these proteins that I've told you that aggregate in the brains of people who have Alzheimer's disease and are responsible for amyloid plaques. So there is a 50% risk of a person or a parent passing one of these rare familial genes to their children. And symptoms of in individuals who have these mutations usually start very young, so in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. And as I've said, the earlier symptom starts, the more likely it is that disease is genetic. But the important take home here is that familial Alzheimer's disease is very rare, and it probably accounts for fewer than 1 in 100 early onset dementia cases. Now, we know that genes are really important in building and maintaining our bodies, but physical characteristics and their chances of developing conditions also depend a lot on our lifestyle and our environment. So now I'm going to touch on risk genes, and this is something that confuses a lot of people. So there's a number of genes that have been found that don't directly cause dementia, like those that we've discussed previously, but they affect someone's risk of developing dementia. So again, turning to Alzheimer's disease as an example, inheriting the E4 version or variant of the gene apolipoprotein E increases a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So we each get 2 copies of this gene, and we know that with 1 copy of E4, there's an increased risk, and with 2 copies that risk is increased further. But some people with an ApoE4 allele will never get Alzheimer's disease, and others who develop Alzheimer's disease don't have any ApoE4 alleles. To take this further, having a close relative, so a parent or a sibling with Alzheimer's disease, increases your own chances of developing the disease very slightly compared to someone with no family history. So it does not mean that dementia is inevitable if somebody in your family is affected. And it's very rare for genes to be the sole cause of dementia. So there are so many factors at play in the development of dementia. So the next thing I'm going to consider is why people delay seeking a diagnosis. And unfortunately, many of us would fail to challenge changes in cognitive and thinking abilities in both ourselves and others, the way we would other common physical medical conditions. And this is also true for a number of mental health conditions, and really this has to change. So if we focus here on dementia, we have to consider why people do this. And it's not entirely surprising because it's been reported that dementia is one of the most feared conditions of our time. And indeed, some polls have suggested that people fear dementia more than death. And this message is really fueled by negative messaging around dementia generally, and the misconception that life ends when a diagnosis of dementia is obtained. And this really simply is not true. And many people can live well with dementia for some time. Furthermore, the benefits of any early interventions in dementia are clear. They mean that people can access treatments and advice and support, and that they can plan ahead. And really, really importantly, if a new therapy was to become available, patients would benefit most if they started that treatment as early as possible. So feeding into this fear is the thought process of embarrassment and stigma that unfortunately still for some surrounds the diagnosis of dementia. Fear, embarrassment and stigma may all lead to concealment, minimization or dismissal of early signs and symptoms of a problem. Having gone through this myself, another key issue is shifting our expectations of normal and those that we know and love. So when we begin to notice changes in a loved one, human nature is to try and rationalize them and to explain them away. So we may think our loved one is tired, or they're getting over a physical illness, or they're depressed. But worryingly, we may even gradually shift our thinking about what's normal for them. And this becomes a problem because time passes quickly, as we know, and really insidious or small month-by-month changes can mean that these cognitive deficits or deficits in memory that we see can begin to affect daily living within maybe 6 months or a year. Here, the misconception that dementia is an inevitable part of aging doesn't help. So if we have a significant proportion of the public that feel that significant impairments in cognitive function and memory are a normal part of aging process, they won't seek a diagnosis for themselves or for a loved one. For some people, they may simply not wish to know that they have dementia. And that's likely fueled by all of the things we've just talked about. So fear, embarrassment, and that misconception that you can't live well while having dementia. So the only way that we can overcome all of this is by educating ourselves and others, and really continuing to work towards achieving disease-modifying drugs and cures for this condition. So there are delays associated with the diagnostic process itself. And we know that GPs are central to the early diagnosis and management of dementia. But many GPs lack confidence in their diagnostic skills and management of the condition. And indeed, some have negative attitudes towards disclosure. So some may take a paternalistic view and decide not to share a diagnosis with the patient. And this is probably fueled by the absence of effective therapies and the fear of how, a long-standing, well-known patient will respond to a diagnosis. But it's not commonplace, and GPs are really, really essential in that early discovery of problems with our memory. So GPs can rule out these potentially reversible causes for dementia-like symptoms. So those things like vitamin B12 deficiency or depression or thyroid disturbances. And GPs will also assess things like vision and hearing that can impact upon your memory performance. So when concern is warranted after a GP has investigated, blood tests and done some cognitive assessments, they'll refer someone to a specialist clinic. And once we receive that referral, then it's common to have delays in assessment and feedback. And that's really due to the increasing numbers of patients that we see. So sadly, in many cases, years can pass from first noticing a problem to receiving a formal diagnosis. And we absolutely need to change this. And a major breakthrough here would be if specific diagnostic tests were available for different types of dementia. So at the moment, while someone is alive, we only ever get a probable diagnosis. So if we were able to develop blood-based biomarkers, for example, for diagnosis, that would be a huge leap forward in the field. So next, I'd like to cover how we can reduce our risk of dementia. And last year in 2020, we had an update to the Lancet Commission on dementia prevention, intervention and care. And this presented a life course model showing that there were 12 potentially modifiable risk factors that account for about 40% of worldwide dementias. And what this means is that approximately 40% of worldwide dementias could theoretically be prevented or delayed. And the key message here is that it's never too early and never too late in the life course for dementia prevention. So what is a risk factor? A risk factor is something that increases your likelihood of developing a condition. And some risk factors we know, like our age and our genetics, we can't change. But there are others, including things like smoking or diet or not getting enough exercise, that we can try to do something about. And that's what we mean here by a modifiable risk factor. We also know that many, many people live a healthy and active lifestyle and still develop dementia. And I really want to stress here, there's no blame associated with a dementia diagnosis, but it is important to consider the things that we can do to reduce our chance of developing dementia. And this important research suggests that around 40% of cases may be due to factors that we could change. So we're going to look at those in a bit more detail. So they've considered 3 different life courses here: early life, midlife, and later life. And early life is considered younger than 45 years. And here risks such as less education were identified. And less education affects cognitive reserve. So policy should obviously then prioritise childhood education for all. And why this is important is because people in otherwise good physical health can sustain a higher burden of neuropathology. So that is a higher burden of changes in their brain, without any cognitive impairment if they have good cognitive reserve. So if we have two people with the same amount of age-related changes in their brain, we often see that they can perform vastly differently on cognitive tasks. And cognitive reserve is thought to explain this. So that is why there's such importance associated with education. Midlife then, in the context of this study, was between 45 and 65 years of age. And risk factors in this age group influence both your cognitive reserve, but also the triggering of these neuropathological developments, so the aggregation and the promotion of damaging processes in the brain. So the top one here is hearing impairment, and hearing impairment really significantly impacts risk. And importantly, the use of hearing aids appears to reduce the excess risk from hearing loss. And indeed, recent research we've published at Ulster University, led by Dr. Magda Bullock, has demonstrated a reduced risk of conversion from mild cognitive impairment to dementia for hearing aid users. So the message here really is that if we have hearing issues, we should get tested and we should wear a hearing aid and correct those as soon as possible. The next thing is traumatic brain injury. And while we maybe associate this with having a car accident or a fall, it also includes things like repetitive mild head injuries, like those associated with sports. And I know there's a number of cases in the media about footballers and so on. So here, I think public health initiatives that minimise head injury in sports are vital in protecting ourselves at a young age and mid-age as much as possible from any form of head injury. Hypertension then is associated with a 2% risk overall. And we know that in midlife, we should really aim for good blood pressure control to delay or prevent dementia. In terms of alcohol, decreasing harmful alcohol drinking has the potential to reduce both young onset and later onset dementia. And obesity is also an issue. So we know for some time that what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. So by reducing levels of obesity, we can also reduce the linked conditions of diabetes, and hypertension is also associated with obesity that would further reduce the risk. In later life then, in this study, in this Lancet study, this was classified as those over 65 years of age. And the risk factors here all also influence cognitive reserve and also these triggering of the brain changes that are associated with dementia. So smoking here is associated with a significantly increased risk. So they'd advocate for avoiding smoking uptake, but also supporting smoking cessation and stopping smoking strategies, as it reduces the risk of dementia. And that applies even when it's stopped in later life. I mean, that's important, in that message that it's never too late. Depression is also really significantly associated, particularly in later life, with dementia incidence. But it's sort of confusing because dementia is also part of the prodrome and the early stages of dementia. But there are some suggestions that treatment of depression may delay the progression of Alzheimer's disease, but more research really in this area is needed. But again, some of our research work into risk factors really supports this association of depression with risk. And again, I think mental health conditions also suffer with this burden of stigma and so on. And that has to stop. Physical processes are at play in all health conditions, including mental health conditions. And we shouldn't avoid seeking help if we need it. Social isolation then is also associated with an enhanced risk. And social contact indeed is a protective factor for dementia, and that's because interacting with other people enhances your cognitive reserve and encourages beneficial behaviours. So you meet friends, you go for a walk. That all has positive health impacts. Physical inactivity is also a risk. So sustained exercise in midlife and keeping that on in later life is protective. And that's because of a number of things. We know that increased activity decreases our likelihood of obesity and diabetes and those cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension. So activity, it doesn't have to be running a marathon, walking, and just being generally active is very beneficial. One of the newer factors that was added to this 2020 list was air pollution. And air pollution generally is associated with poor health outcomes, but it also has potential effects on the brain. And a number of animal studies have really shown that airborne pollutants can accelerate these neurodegenerative processes, so these brain changes, by affecting how blood vessels function, and also affect the accumulation of these toxic proteins in the brain. And diabetes is also a key risk factor for dementia, and it's one that I'm particularly interested in from a research perspective. And here there's a number of mechanisms that are linked, including inflammatory processes, but also things like brain insulin resistance that can help explain the relationship between the two conditions. But this, again, also offers some hope that some of these processes can be targeted by drugs. So when it comes to reducing risk, we can do what we can, basically, and every little thing that we do can help. So I think for people, it's very empowering to know that we can do things to take control over these risk factors that we have control over. So yes, we can't change our age or we can't change our genetics, but we can change our behaviors. So firstly, look after your heart and your general health. Try to stop smoking. Try to keep your blood pressure in check. Go for a walk. Eat well. Drink alcohol responsibly. But it's important to keep challenging your brain too. So read, write, do crosswords, Sudoku. All of that stuff helps to build and maintain your cognitive reserve. But it's really also important to take care of your mental well-being. So do things that make you feel relaxed and happy, and if you are suffering from depression, visit your GP and seek help. And finally, stay connected. And I know at the moment, obviously, it's more difficult. We're living through Zoom and through phone calls, but that's still important. Reach out to people, join groups. And if you're noticing any hearing difficulties, get those checked and corrected, as they really can have a profound effect on our risk. So research is vital to defeat dementia, and this is a really important dementia. So we know that dementia can have a devastating impact on our lives and on our families, but it also has an enormous burden, to the wider economy. So it's estimated that it costs £26 billion a year in the UK alone. And that's expected to double in the next 25 years to about 55 billion by 2040. And globally, the cost is about £817 billion. So, it's a significant economic as well as a social problem. But historically, funding for dementia research has been significantly lower than for other diseases such as cancer, despite the fact that the cost of dementia is more, than heart disease and cancer combined. And I would argue that dementia really deserves funding so that we can prevent the devastation that it causes. So the orange graph that I have up here on the right shows the amount of funding received for every £1 million of costs for cancer, for coronary heart disease, and for dementia. And it really demonstrates very clearly, I think, that for the same level of cost, dementia receives the least investment of research. And this really has to change if we want to find disease-modifying therapies and we want to find a cure for the condition. So the figures on this slide are taken from a Public Health England report on trends on mortality rates or death rates from dementia and Alzheimer's disease, heart disease and stroke, so the leading causes of death in the UK now. And in 2012, the mortality rate for women, which here is illustrated on the right, overtook heart disease. And in males, it was estimated that that rate would overtake heart disease by 2020. So unfortunately, the existing medications that we have to treat dementia are not able to affect the underlying disease processes. So we really need to better understand dementia, understand those underlying disease processes, and discover new drugs that can impact on the disease process itself to begin to reduce this trend and to reduce the mortality that's associated with dementia. Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. So really, only via research can we understand the causes of dementia. So we need to look at that. We need to look at factors that influence our risk of dementia and better understand those so that there can be public health messaging around that. We need to understand the underlying disease processes in great detail to allow us to develop new treatments. We need to improve the diagnostic tools and processes so that we can have a more personalised approach to diagnosis. We need to assess preventative strategies and how well these can work within our population. But we also need to look at things like care and services that can improve the lives of people living with dementia for their families and for their carers. And really importantly, we need the active involvement of those living with dementia and affected by dementia in our research. And that's to ensure it's relevant and it addresses the needs of the population at hand. So within my lab at Ulster, I have a number of different research studies in the field. And the first are really focused on preclinical drug discovery and development, where we look at novel drug targets for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions. And that also includes drugs that were originally designed for the treatment of diabetes, and also some newer molecules that target the immune system, as we know that there's dysregulation in the immune system and inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. And what we do here is that we evaluate these promising targets in animal models of Alzheimer's disease. And these models develop many of the same pathologies or changes that we see in humans. So including those amyloid plaques that I talked about in the brain, but they also display learning deficits. And these are the gold standard for drug development, for new diseases. So within these models, we assess the impact of these potential new drugs on learning and memory, on these biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. So in this slide, I'm showing one of our promising targets being able to change how much amyloid aggregates in the brain. And we also look at changes to the underlying disease processes. So things that we know are potentially disease modifying is what we're attempting to design. So one of the drug candidates that I've worked on is now in clinical trials, and it's hoped that some of the newer agents that we're working with that target the immune system may also progress to human trials. So I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has really illustrated is where there are funds and where there is willingness, new research can be done and can be translated to the clinic quickly. And I really think our focus needs to move in this way in the field of dementia. In terms of clinical studies, so within the Northern Ireland Centre for Stratified Medicine, I have an ongoing study called Stratification in Alzheimer's Disease. And this study aims to group or stratify patients that have different age of onset of Alzheimer's disease, because we really don't understand why some people, develop it beyond genetics, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And obviously there's a big difference in someone developing the condition, when they're 65 compared to when they're 85 in terms of years lived with disability. So we're interested to see if there's genetic or biochemical or environmental factors or other diseases that people have that are associated with this age of onset. And we're also interested in following disease progression in order to determine if there's factors that influence the rate of progression of disease, because we know that some people progress quite quickly and some people progress quite slowly. And at the moment, we really don't understand why that is. So some of the questions within this project that we hope to address are, Firstly, to identify whether there are, subtypes of Alzheimer's disease beyond, less than 65 and more than 65. Can we better group people that have different processes that are underlying or driving the disease in them? Secondly, are there any biomarkers that are associated with response to existing therapies? So there are only 2 classes of drugs currently available to treat Alzheimer's disease, and not everybody responds to these or derives any benefit from them. So we would like to be able to understand why that is. And finally, we'd also like to determine whether we can predict things like progression of sleep disturbance or occurrence of behaviours that challenge. And that's because these factors are really important in why people have to move into institutional care, and when families struggle to cope, if there are behaviours that challenge. So we really need to better understand this. So in summary, we're going to look for genetic and protein markers of disease generally. So can we improve the diagnosis of different types of dementia? Can we identify biomarkers that are associated with response to existing drugs and fast and slow progression? And we're going to bring clinical history and other aspects of risk into these studies. Slide is stuck. So my take-home messages today really are that dementia is an umbrella term that's used to describe a group of symptoms, including memory loss, confusion, mood changes, and difficulty with day-to-day tasks. And Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause. So it's not every cause, it's the most common cause. That dementia affects about 15,000 people in Northern Ireland and 850,000 people in the UK. That dementia is not an inevitable part of aging or a commonly inherited condition, and you can live well with dementia. We should not delay in speaking to our GP if we are concerned about our memory or that of a loved one. That making positive lifestyle choices can reduce our risk of dementia, so we have some control over the risk factors, I think, which is an empowering message. And also then that research really is the only way that we'll be able to defeat dementia. So that's my talk. I thank you for your attention, and I'm just going to have a look. So if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take those.